Um, Thanks to everyone for joining our Black History Month observance by the Ministry of Christian Education. Most of you know me. I'm Alan Carswell, the Minister of Christian Education for Third Street Church of God, and also we have Debbie Hardy, who's an at-large member of the Board of Christian Education. And we had decided we do a Black History Month celebration of some kind every year in February. So we decided this year to do a session on genealogy, something that was of intense interest to myself and Debbie. So what we want to do is to share a few thoughts about, there's a song called Digging Your Roots, Kunta Kinte. So that's what we're going to be doing. What I'm going to do is, it's a PowerPoint, and I'm going to share my screen, the presentation. And I ask that if you are, most people are coming in muted, so I think it would be good if you could stay muted just so that extraneous noise won't come in. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, we entitled our presentation, Finding Your Own Roots. And we're talking about Black genealogy. Black genealogy is a special flavor of genealogy. So the first question is, why genealogy? Why do you want to search your roots? And I think everybody can come up with some reasons, but Debbie and I put a few thoughts together. Just the idea of knowing where you're from, knowing your background. It's always nice to know where you're coming from. And, so that's a good thing to do. Finding new relatives. Our family, the Carswell Hightower family, has expanded because we're finding new relatives and, who are living now. So, as well as, going to the past. Everybody, I think most people like a great puzzle. So it's a great detective story. So when you're doing some exploration and you find a fact and some kind of finding or information that is, just revealing, it's a great sense of fulfillment. And also, one item is that you sort of weave your family history into the history of the country. So some of the events in the past, of course, slavery, Reconstruction for Blacks, Jim Crow, all those kinds of things, the Voting Rights Act and so forth. Your family is tied into that history. And I'm just thinking, 100 years from now, your descendants will be tying your history, your lifestyle into that pandemic of 2020. So how it all ties in together. And along those lines about being a part of history, I want to show a short video about a connection that has been made.
This is America's history. Our nation was shaped not only by great events, but also by the smallest details of our ancestors' lives.
The vote is the most powerful instrument, most powerful nonviolent tool in a democratic society. But knowing that a member of my family registered and voted in Alabama 100 years before I did, before my mother, my father, my grandparents. It's amazing. So maybe, just maybe, it's part of my DNA, my bloodline, or whatever you want to call it. It's just incredible. This is too much.
This is America's.
So I think we've all had, well, I certainly have had great emotional moments when I find some facts about my past and how it relates to the American past. So, that's one of the great rewards of researching your roots. You want to add anything, Debbie?
Yeah, I think it was a natural progression for me, and it was an act of love. When a lot of my family started to die off, and my mother and father passed away, and in 2016, when my father passed away, I said I wanted to find more about my family roots. And I had talked about it with my father, and you'll see later in the video, or later in one of the pictures, he had left two suitcases full of important documents. So we talked about it a lot. And I never really had the time, but in 2016, when my father died and I lost my job, I had time. I had time to do a lot of research with my family. So it was amazing. The information that I found out, some was surprising, some was, dispel different tales that was passed down, but it's an interesting process. And also I wanted to do it for health reasons. Most of my family on my father's side died from cancer. So cancer runs rapid in my family. All of the men had prostate cancer. And a lot of the women had high blood pressure. So that's an important reason too, to find out about the makeup of your family.
Yeah. When you go to the doctor or your primary care physician or general practitioner, part of the intake process is to ask about family history. And so that's very important. So how do we start this journey? How do you start researching your roots? And so one thing to do is to get started, just identify or what you know, just your personal knowledge. I believe there's somebody in the waiting room. So, just start by making a list, yourself, siblings, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. And you start drawing a simple chart, a simple family tree. I have an old family tree that was actually drawn by my aunts of our family, me and my brothers and sisters and my parents. And start collecting documentation. Everybody has things that you keep your own memorabilia. Just assemble that material. And you want to develop some kind of filing system. The main thing about a filing system is that you want it to, wherever you put something, you want to be able to retrieve it. Just remember where you put it. Assemble what materials you have. Oftentimes people put their lineage in a family Bible. There's a Bible sitting around. Birth, marriage, and divorce, unfortunately divorce records, death records. Just pull all those records together, assemble them. Important papers, wills, deeds, property information, things like that. And one item that I found that was very useful is funeral programs. What I'm showing here is a funeral program for my cousin, Phyllis Foreman. And that obituary has a lot of information. That can have a lot of information that you will find useful. For instance, you could tell where they were born, when they were born, who their parents were, who their siblings were. When you look at the where they lived, location is important to genealogy too. So all these kinds of information can be found in an obituary. I've had to write some obituaries, unfortunately, but as I write the obituary, I realize that could be a historical document that somebody's going to look at 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now and use that to research their family tree. Debbie, anything else to add?
Yeah, I wanted to say that when you were talking about the obituary, I saw obituaries where people just made up stuff. So you just can't go by an obituary. You have to be able to fact check that document, but it is good to have. And also military, I don't know if you mentioned military records. That's something good to have. Insurance papers. Now, a lot of people can go back and look at different organizations that they joined, like Delta, or different organizations, and they also have census records. And you can also put together photos. So now when you do photos, it's important to put the dates and the names of people, because I have a lot of photos where I'm like, who is this person? And I had to ask thank God, my parents were alive. My father was alive at the time, and he was able to identify the names of the people. So I think that's important. And one other important is to pass down information to your family that's accurate, because that can be part of historic documents as well.
Yeah, we're going to talk more about that, particularly the accuracy of historical documents. It can be questionable, and generally you want to have multiple pieces of evidence for any particular finding. The next step would be what I call the oral tradition. Sitting down and talk with family members, certainly your previous generations, if you're still blessed to have your parents or grandparents, aunts and uncles around, sit down and talk with them. Your own generation, siblings and cousins, people. We had one of my cousins who's passed away, took upon himself to be the unofficial historian of the family. So he had a lot of background knowledge. And so the kind of questions that you ask can include names of parents, grandparents. You also want to include maiden names, because that can give you other clues if you want to trace the mother's side of the family. Where did they live? And it could be in more than one place, because that will help you when you do searches through the records. Old documents and photos that they have in their possession, take pictures so you don't take them from them. Another tidbits of information, military service, life events, etc. What I'm showing here is I sat down with my mother in 2000, 20 years ago, and just talked with her about her background, and I just took these notes. It wasn't, I just decided to do it, and fortunately I decided to keep these notes. And so she gave me some tips about who were her parents and grandparents. A couple comments about it. You may notice that she talks about somebody named Doni, and my mother says she had a reputation of being a loose woman. So, you take that for what it's worth, but that's just the information that you need to have. And she also said that Doni has some Indian blood. Now, I'm finding out that how many people here, you don't have to say, but many of you may think you have Indian blood in your ancestry, but it seems to be an urban myth. So you want to verify that somehow to make sure that that's actually true, because maybe something that's passed down as part of the the folklore of your family, but it may or may not be actually true. Be prepared for surprises, because you may find out that a cousin might have been adopted, for instance. You want to be open-minded and follow the facts, not just family myths. Compare different sources. Again, if you have two or three pieces of information that point to the same fact, that gives you more confidence in that particular fact, that it is accurate. Keep copious notes, jot it down and keep good records. Okay. Anything else, Debbie?
No, I was just going to say that it can become overwhelming. I have, I took notes, but I also have things on USB port, a lot of important documents. So because if your computer breaks down, you have lost everything on your computer. So you can store it on a USB port. And also I have paper documents that I put in binders according to family members. So that's a good way to keep up with your documents as well. But, you know, one of the mistakes that I made when I was doing the family tree, and we'll get into that later, but when I made a family tree on Ancestry.com, because I had joined them, one of the mistakes I made, a lot of my relatives, some of my relatives I found was already, you know, doing the research. And so when I found the research to be the same and we had verified all the information, I tried to merge it. And then I had double, and, you know, it was like double people. So then I got frustrated because I was actually doing this for like 3 years, 2016 to 2018. And I got, you know, frustrated. So I put it down. So eventually I will go back to it and kind of straighten out that family tree because there was a lot of information tied to it.
We'll talk about some lessons learned later in the presentation.
Yes.
That's a good precursor to it. Okay. This is Debbie's letter. We were talking about collecting information. Debbie had a letter from her great aunt Alma. You want to talk about that?
Yes, my great aunt Alma lived to 100 and she was 104.5. I don't, you know, 104.5, 6. I'm not really sure, but I remember she was born in Alabama. You know, both of my parents was born in Alabama and different parts. And then she lived across the street from me. She wrote a letter, and we call it a historical document. She wrote 2 letters to my uncle who lived in Seattle, Washington, because his, you know, they were out there far away from, you know, the rest of the family. So she wanted the family to know about what was going on. So this is the first letter that she wrote, and I'm not going to read it, but I'm just going to give you some highlights of some of the things she wrote. And this was the Hardy family. And she talked about my grandfather, Bob Hardy, and Callie Hardy, who's my grandmother and grandfather, and where they lived, when they got married, how they met, the children that they had. She talked about her brothers and sisters. She talked about that my grandfather was a contractor. He worked in a coal mine and, you know, taking coal out of stoves, if you know what that means, and how he belonged to a Methodist church. And he was very active in Sunday school and used to take my father to church. Also, she gave a lot of detailed records about their lives, and it was really interesting. And she put a lot of names in there. My grandfather was married more than one time, so that was very helpful to me because I was able to track all the information that that she had in the letter to verify that this was true.
Okay, thank you. All right, we're going to talk about what I call primary sources, the original information. One of the big ones, of course, is the United States Census. I hope everybody filled out your census form last year because that's a very important method by which the government allocates federal resources and makes decisions about different parts of the country. It's been taken every 10 years since the year 1790, and it's supposed to be an exhaustive record of every person, quote unquote, in the U.S. You'll note that I have put person in quotation marks. Some of you may know why I did that, but that's what it is supposed to do. It's available online up to the year 1940. The records remain confidential for 72 years. You can request more recent information about yourself or an ancestor. One of the big gaps is that the 1890 records, most of them were destroyed in the fire. What's happened in recent years is that they've been digitized, put online, and searchable. What I'm showing here is my great-grandfather. This is the 1870 census, the earliest census that my family members would have appeared. Richard Carswell, he was 24, male, black, a farm laborer, and this is in Georgia. It was quite a finding to go back, you know, a century and a half to find one of my ancestors. Anything else want to add about the census?
Not really.
Okay.
The census, I can add one thing. When I was checking the census against the records, sometimes they spell the name wrong, but you can tell that it's part of your family by the rest of the information, by the date of birth, by the other people that lived in the house that you know about. And I also found sometimes it was nicknames on there. Like one of the names on my father's census was Dimples. And I knew that that was my aunt because all the other relatives that was listed, I was able to know because I knew them. So Dimples was really Ada, and there's a lot of Adas in my family.
Yeah, so again, it's well, you call it triangulation. Using several pieces of information to come to a conclusion. The item about misspelling. See what happens with when you put the census online to make it searchable. Somebody has to read that name, Richard Carswell, and type it into a data field so that you can search for Richard Carswell. So we're relying on the interpretation of a person of that. That's Richard Carswell. That could easily have been coded as Richard Caswell if you look at that closely. Unfortunately, they put it in right as Richard Carswell. Okay. Other primary sources, birth, marriage, and death records, certainly military records, draft, service, and discharge records. I was able to find my father and my uncle's military registration, draft registration. And it goes back to the Civil War, both for the Union and Confederate armies, World War I, World War II. Many of these records are state-based. So again, that's why it's good to know the location where your ancestors were. Court records, many of them are available online now or searchable. Criminal and civil cases, adoptions, and assignment of guardianship, probate records when somebody passes away, somebody files a will. One of the ways to find out about slaves is if a slaveholder dies and is particularly kind slaveholder, they may free their slaves and grant some land or property to them, and that may show up in a will. This is before the Civil War. What I'm showing here is a marriage certificate of Jordan Hightower and Fanny Battle. This is my great grandmother. I was able to find this. This happened in 1886. So again, we're just putting all those pieces of information together. Okay, Debbie, anything?
Yes, I wanted to tell you about an interesting experience that I had. I was trying, when I was following the family roots of my mother, I knew about my great grandmother, but I didn't know about her mother. So I was trying to find it, and I was always told her name was Patsy. So I went to Alabama, but I went to Lamar, Alabama, where I knew that where she lived and where the records were. I had found that out through research. So I went to the Department of Vital Statistics, and I found a copy of my great grandmother's marriage certificate. And I knew that her mother's name would be on there. And then I found that her mother's name was actually Martha. And so when I was talking to the people there, they said Patsy at that time was a nickname. So that had stopped my research. I had a block in my research, but now I can go back and look under Martha because I did find a lot of Marthas, and I did find a lot of Janes under Martha. So now I have to go back and follow that. So I just wanted to say, if you come to a roadblock, don't give up. Just keep going and look for other information.
Okay, thank you. Some more primary sources, voter records, voter registrations, something called oath books. These, and I'll show you one in the next slide, where after the Civil War, the southern states were required to register Black and white voters, everybody, and to be able to vote, a person who had to swear an oath of allegiance to the United States. And so that's what those oaths, they're recorded in oath books. There's an outfit called the Freedmen's Bureau that'll set up to maintain records about freed slaves. Just think about it. If you were a slave all your life and all of a sudden you were free, how do you navigate it? How do you, find a job? It's a whole different kind of relationship being a slave. That slave master doesn't have the responsibility to feed you anymore. You got to feed yourself, but you have to earn money to feed yourself. So all the kind of issues that freed slaves had to confront, the Freedmen's Bureau was set up to help them address that and navigate a post-slavery life. And Freedmen's Bureau has a lot of information that you can search by name. Newspapers are helpful sometimes, certainly obituaries, but there may be news stories. What I'm showing here is my parents celebrating the 45th anniversary in Florida. Somebody sees this, years from now, they can gather information about this. All this here, I know because I or my brothers and sisters provided the information. But that can get disconnected over the years. So this may be a revelation to somebody who's researching their roots in the future. I do want to avoid being too American-centric. So there are international sources, particularly for our Caribbean friends and colleagues. So some of these search databases are international. Ancestry.com, I'm pretty sure is. I know that the site that I use is also international, so it is worldwide records. I didn't spend a lot of time. I noticed that there are records in Jamaica, for instance, of people in the past. So yeah, we definitely want to make sure that we include our people from other countries. Okay. Debbie, anything?
No.
Okay. I talked about the oath books. This is 1867. Again, I had mentioned Richard Carswell. This is Washington County, state of Georgia. And notice that there was a Richard Carswell. Oops. There, you see him? So I kind of had the same reaction that John Lewis had when he found out that his ancestor registered to vote. This was my exact same situation. This was around the time of the election. I shared it with my family and I shared it on Facebook. You can sort of put yourself in their feet, in their shoes. Think about it where you were a slave all your life and all of a sudden you're free. You got to figure out how to live, where to work, how to find a place, a house, or whatever. And in the midst of all that, my great-grandfather took the time to register to vote. He thought that was a precious, precious, precious right to have, and he treasured that. Unfortunately, women couldn't vote at the time, but at least he took the time to vote. Interesting story. If you want to look up the terms Reconstruction and Jim Crow, what happened was, for a given slaveholder might have 10, 20, 30 slaves. So just a matter of population, there were more Black people than white people in many of these southern states. And all of a sudden, these Black people could vote. Can you imagine what happened? Black people started being elected to state legislators, to the U.S. Congress, mayors, and so white people couldn't have. They wouldn't stand for that. So they enacted a bunch of laws. You've heard of Jim Crow laws to restrict the rights of Blacks to vote. So voter suppression is not a new thing. This is something you might want to read up on about how, they instituted poll tax, literacy tests, just to prevent Black people from voting. Now, it also prevented white people from voting if they didn't have any money, if they were illiterate. However, they enacted something called a grandfather clause. You've heard that term before? A grandfather clause is if your grandfather could vote, you could vote. Slick, isn't it? So,
Could I just add one thing? I found out doing research that my grandfather also voted, and he was a Republican, and he voted in every election. And I thought that was kind of humorous for me, but I think the Republican Party at that time was a little different. But,
well, that's the party of Lincoln. Lincoln was a Republican.
Right. So he voted in every election.
My, how times have changed, huh? Now, they talked about primary sources. A lot of these sources, they're stored in places like archives, state houses, county, county seats, and so forth. You used to have to go out and get them. We're blessed to be in the same location as the National Archives. And 20, 25 years ago, I would go to the National Archives to retrieve census records. These records are stored on microfilm. So, it's quite an adventure. So you flip through these microfilm rolls to find somebody, and then you bring the image up on the reader, then you will print it out. Now, all this stuff, or much of this stuff, is online now. And the two main sites are Ancestry.com and FamilySearch.org. Ancestry.com is probably the big player in this market, very popular. However, it's a paid subscription. I've started using FamilySearch.org. This is free. It's maintained by the Mormon Church. It's not as comprehensive as Ancestry.com, but it is pretty good. So it's a way to get started. So we'll talk about the pros and cons of Ancestry.com. I think it's the next slide. Yeah, Debbie, you want to talk about the pros and cons of Ancestry.com?
Well, let me just say that I joined Ancestry.com in 2016 because I wanted to find out more about my family, but I did not I did the DNA, but I did not give them permission to research or do anything other than connect with my family. So I wanted to make that clear because after I did the research, I called them and I said, how are you going to be using this DNA? Because a lot of people are afraid to do that. So that's why I wanted to make that clear. Hopefully 50 years from now, they won't be doing that, giving your DNA and they just using it to connect you with other family members. But the pros and cons of DNA is very, very easy to use. In fact, I have a box. I don't know if you can see it, but I have a box that this is the original DNA box that comes in. I'm sending this to my cousin because I wanted my, well, at the time she was 98 years, now she's 100, but I wanted her to do because she's the oldest living relative, but because she take a lot of medication and she's in a nursing home, I wasn't able to get that to her. So I'm going to send that to my cousin. But what happens is they send you a box, and inside the box is another box with 2 tubes. You put your spit, you have to spit into the tube, and then there's some liquid or something in there, a chemical that you shake it up, and then you send it back. You have to have an email address, and everything is by number. So the same person that's getting your DNA, and then they send it out to a lab, is only identifiable by a number. So the people that are actually doing the work with the DNA do not have your information. And so what I did is have, and I'm just giving you a little background before I get into the pros and cons, is I wanted to make sure that Ancestry.com was legit. So a lot of my family members took the test and they changed their names and we matched. So it is legit. They have over 16 billion records. It's easy to access, to conduct, to verify the information through more than one source. You can, save the information, but you can access historical records, newspapers, international records, and you can do a family tree, which is really, really easy to do. And then it makes the connections. And also it talks about where, your ethnic makeup. And most of us know that we're from Africa, but you also have white ancestors because of slavery. You might have Indian, you might have Sweden, you might have different, it is just amazing. Like,
Yeah, we'll talk more about that, Debbie, later.
okay. Well, let me just tell you about the cons then. The cons is, I just get into it, I'm sorry. I just love it. But the cons is the cost. You have to pay for the DNA. It can be costly, but the best time to do it is when they have a holiday. Then it's like half price or even less than that. And also is another cost if you want to join a subscription to go further, to do international, or, you know, to go deep into your roots. So it's time consuming, and you have to really love it. It's time consuming. It's also reconciling facts versus family myths. That can be either a plus or a rejection for you. And then when you do find your members, and like Brother Allen said, if you find that, you know, somehow you were adopted, that might put a whole nother spin on it. And when you find new family members and you want to connect with them, they might reject you. So there are some positive, but I think the positive outweigh the negative.
Okay, thank you. Now, we've alluded to the elephant in the room, what's known as that peculiar institution, also known as slavery. So we want to sort of confront that head on, how it affects your family tree. I'll show a short video.
But the vast majority of our ancestors remained enslaved for more than 80 years following the revolution, and reclaiming even the most basic details about their lives is very, very difficult. We now move to your maternal great-great-grandfather, and his name was Alex Mclamb, and he was born in South Carolina in about 1847. The only way to learn about a slave ancestor is to identify the owner and look for his records.
Am I getting ready to find out my grandfather was owned by Pat Sajak's family or something?
But we scoured all the records of South Carolina, so this is what we found. Okay, this is a page from the 1860 Federal Census, the 1860 slave schedule.
Slave schedule?
Yeah, well, was like this.
1 o'clock, whooping. 1:21, whooping again. 2 o'clock, cry.
Black people were property, so they weren't listed in the census because you didn't exist.
Wow.
You didn't exist. The only way you existed was the same way a cow or a chicken existed, under a white man's name in a separate part of the census, a completely different census called the slave schedule. And then they didn't list you by name, they listed you by your color, whether you're mulatto, black, your gender, whether you're male or female, and your age. This is the 1860 slave schedule for Solomon Mclamb. If Solomon owned your great-great-grandfather, Alex, he would be listed as a male slave at about the age of 22.
22, I see a male.
That is your great-great-grandfather. No name, 22. Yeah, it was the most brilliantly sinister part of slavery. And I think that that has done a lot to undermine our self-confidence as a people. How does it feel to see a human being reduced to a hash mark?
Right.
But that was it. They wouldn't let you have any other identity.
You're just lost. And you kind of don't belong to anything. And when you don't belong to anything, you're so much more likely to end up in something bad. Mm-hmm. You know, it's amazing any of us have accomplished anything without knowing where we're from.
Yeah.
Really.
Okay. So the impact of slavery on your tree: Black people were property, weren't worthy of being registered or listed, except as a piece of property. You know, along with the pigs and chickens, you got slaves. for genealogy research in terms of the census, black genealogists refer to the 1870 brick wall. 1870 was the first census after the Civil War. The 1860 census, of course, was when the Civil War started. And so slaves don't appear by name in the census records until they were freed so the first census after the Civil War, of course, is 1870. Now, some of you may have been blessed to have free Black ancestors, and they will appear in earlier census records. So, there were free Black people before the Civil War. Either they bought their freedom or were born into it or whatever, but they would appear in the census. This is sort of my corresponding revelation to what Chris Rock had seen. And again, it's not a certain thing, but I just did I did some research about in the county where my ancestors came from, and looked at the slave schedules. And if I found a Black male who was of the right age, that likely was my great grandfather. This might have been the Richard Carswell that I referred to earlier. This is the 1860 census. Okay. Now Debbie talked about DNA testing. There are two major kinds. The most common kind is autosomal, I think is how it's pronounced. But if you want to research your maternal line, you can use mitochondrial DNA testing. But it does give you a map of your ancestors, a way to point out possible relatives. Health screenings, and I put a question mark there because, as Debbie rightly said, there could be questionable uses of that DNA data. For instance, if you submit it to the DNA and all of a sudden you started getting ads for diabetic medication or cancer medication or whatever, because DNA can show your proclivity towards certain diseases. And it's not a silver bullet, but certainly there are privacy concerns. If you have access to Consumer Reports, the latest issue, I had an article about DNA testing and the concerns and the caveats about using DNA testing. Debbie also alluded to the idea that there might have been white people in your background. I call this cream in your coffee. And play the short video.
Mineral Street, where the colored people live.
Well, we have arrived.
We have arrived. All the white people must have moved out of town. How are you, Miss Rita?
Mom, is that Callie or is that that's a Bruce, I think.
In these faces, we encounter an aspect of our history that all African Americans must confront. As we trace our roots, not all of them are going to end up in Africa.
This is my mom.
She looks white.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, they thought they were white growing up until they were out front making fun of Black people. And then my grandmother came out and said, I don't know what y'all making fun of. Y'all Black too.
You have to assume that any Black person has some European ancestry.
Why?
Just rather, just the fact that I am not blue-black, I'm a mocha.
A mocha, a fine mocha.
I'm a fine mocha.
To determine just how much European ancestry we have, I'm turning to the geneticist, Dr. Mark Shriver.
Yeah, so we're gonna spin him around, right?
Dr. Shriver has helped develop an intriguing DNA test. He says that it can estimate the proportion of our genes that we've inherited from our African, Native American, and European ancestors.
What's especially interesting in your case is that you were adopted. So your genealogy can't prepare us for what we might find in your DNA.
Right.
Okay, well, let's find out.
Yeah.
Why don't you turn that page? Now, according to this test, Linda Johnson Rice, you have an extraordinary amount of European ancestry for an African American, 40%. Would you read those results?
20% European.
You're a 1/5 white.
Wow. Oh, man. I'm horrible in sports, so maybe this explains that. My jump shot is horrible.
I'm 35% European.
19% European.
Are you surprised to know that you have that much European ancestry?
I guess so. As dark complected as I am.
Mm-hmm. It means you're a third white.
Well, that's surprising.
You are 33% European.
Really?
I'm 50-50. To my horror, the chairman of African American Studies at Harvard at the time was a half a white man.
Yeah. Wow, you're kidding.
There's a lot of sneaking and creeping back there on the plantation.
I guess. I guess. Oh, my goodness.
So that illustrates, again, you have some cream in your coffee. At the risk of exposing some of my personal information,
Mineral Street.
this is my DNA breakout by region. Of course, most of it's in Africa. However, there are a couple of interesting findings. England and Northwestern Europe, 5%. Scotland, 4%. Sweden, 1%. Maybe that's why I bought a Volvo with my latest car. But I mean, you talk about two pieces of information coming together. That Scotland 4% is kind of interesting because Carswell is a Scottish name. So you talk about Freedmen, that might have been what happened. That's why I got that Scottish, a little bit of Scottish blood in me. That's the kind of map that you'll get when you do a DNA test. Debbie, anything to add?
No.
Okay. All right. I've interspersed my story earlier throughout the presentation up to this point. I just want to talk about how my story got started. The search started with a document that came into my possession. This is my uncle, great uncle, really. Richard Carswell was born December 9th, 1892 in Sandersville, Georgia. This is southern Georgia, not far from where my parents came from, Dublin. This was provided by my cousin, who's the unofficial historian of the family. He tells a story that there was some kind of a race riot near Atlanta in the late 1800s when Richard was a very young child. Now, this is not my great-grandfather, this is my grandfather. Well, it's next, not my grandfather, it's my grandfather's brother. So it's the same generation as my grandfather. So as I tried to trace it, it turns out that the 1890 census would have been very critical in finding, to trace my roots. But as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the 1890 records were destroyed in the fire. I have the 1880 census, an 1870 census, which traces Richard, my great grandfather. However, what my project right now, I'm trying to identify what this riot was that killed my great grandfather. And there's some candidates. I've been looking through newspapers. There's some journals. There's a book that is an encyclopedia of race riots that identified a potential candidate. There was a race riot in Palmetto, Georgia, in 1899 that might have been it, but I really can't directly connect it because Palmetto is a bit of a distance. It's a suburb of Atlanta. Actually, one of my brothers lives in Palmetto. But if I could find something that would place my great grandfather in Palmetto or near Palmetto at that time, then that would be some kind of confirmation. That's what I'm trying to do is make that connection. In any case, some of the great tie-ins that were important in my search was, of course, I mentioned the 1860s slave schedule, where there's a person who fits the age and race and location that might have been my great-grandfather. That 1867 oath book, basically the voter registration. And then the 1870 census was a confirmation because on that 1870 census that I showed earlier, it mentioned that Richard's wife was Marjorie. So that ties into this document. So again, multiple pieces of information tying into the same fact gave me some confirmation. Okay, so that's my story. Debbie, your turn.
Okay, as I said before, the reason why I got involved is because it was actually an act of love, and I had a lot of information already. The two suitcases that you see there on the screen, my father left those, and before he passed away, he wanted me to be the keeper of all of the important documents, because he knew that I was thinking about doing Ancestry and thinking about doing the family roots, and he wanted that legacy to continue. So in those suitcases, one, excuse me, is information about my mother and her history and her family, and my father's suitcase is the same, about him and his family, all kind of things in there, insurance papers, birth certificates, you know, obituaries from different family members, pictures. Is a lot of information. So that's how eventually I got started. If you turn to the next slide. Okay, this is, let me put it on my screen so I can see it on another screen, but this is information or census records. Let me see, hold on 1 second. All right. Okay, this is the census records of my great-grandfather. His name was Prince Hayward, and they just have a piece. See, sometimes they just have like initials, but I know it's him because I can tell from the from my aunts, my great aunts that are in there. And this is my great uncle. This is really interesting. He was married a couple of times. He was married quite a few times, and he was a laborer. He was the one, I don't know if you could see it, but he worked in the coke oven industry, and that's where they would take coal and pull it out. And I think I talked about that before. He was married. This, I think, was his, I'm trying to see his wife's name here. I can't see it, but he was married like 3 or 4 times. And in this particular census, he was married like 12 years.
This was Ada Haywood, is the spouse's name.
I'm sorry?
Ada Haywood.
Oh, that's Ada Haywood. Okay, because I saw Prince Haywood. Prince Haywood was my husband.
Ada is the spouse on this record.
Yeah, Ada is the spouse. Prince Haywood was the
head of household.
Yeah, was the head of household. He was the husband. So Ada household. By that time, you know, that was the last marriage. Okay,
never simple, huh? Okay, ready to go to the next slide?
Yes, please. Okay, this is the document that I was telling you about. This is, you saw the other one, it was the Hardy family. This is the Hayward family. So when we have family reunions, we usually say Hardy, Hayward, and Ware, and now we say Sharp. Sharp is an extension, not blood, but through one of the marriages, part of our family. So I guess they are our cousins because they're, you know, but anyway, the Hayward family is really an interesting document. And my aunt did a really good job of capturing, it's like 4 or 5 pages, and that's just the first page. But she did a really great job in talking about where they lived at the time, what kind of work my great-grandfather did, which was really interesting. And she even talked about his father. And they, at this time, they lived in, not Alabama, but they lived in a town or a city called Talladega, Alabama. And my grandfather, Prince Hayward, was a farmer. And she talked about an interesting story. She said that one day when he was plowing the field, the boss man came out and wanted his wife, Harriet, to work in the field too. And he said, no, he had an attitude. He was like, I didn't marry her for her to be working in the field. I married her to take care of her. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And he left. He threw the plow down and he left. And eventually he was able to buy a family home where a lot of them grew up. But when the grandkids grew up, they moved to Alabama. So she had some really interesting stories about his life. And he was real strong and a big man. And so she had a lot of details in that letter. So I thought that was really important. On the right-hand side of the screen, it shows you that my aunt, this was Cap Garrett, was a great-great-grandfather, and he was married to Harriet Swan. And Ada Garrett, which we talked about a minute ago, was married to Prince Hardy, And then from Ada Garrett and Prince Haywood, rather, came Callie Haywood, and she was married to Barb Hardy. Barb Hardy was my grandfather. That's my father's father. So you can see how it went down. Now, above Cap Garrett, I'll just say this last thing. I was able to find on the slave register, because Cap Garrett wasn't a slave, but his father was probably well, more than likely was a slave, and I think that was him. And they just named him by, it was a 33-year-old Black man, and he was born in 1817. So it kind of fits, and that was the only Garrett that was on the slave register. So I'm thinking that was probably my great-great-great-grandfather.
Okay, next slide.
Okay, this is on my mother's side. Jane Woods, and you'll see a picture of her later. This was my great-grandmother, and she was born between, see, some register says 1852, and some says 1868, so you can't really be sure. But I do have her death record, and I know she died in 1934, and in Birmingham, Alabama, where my mother was born, and the house is still there, and my cousins lived in that house. Her father was Benjamin Pendleton, and it's spelt wrong on there. The Pendleton is really Penningston. Her father was Madison Woods, and I know this record to be true because my mother knew her grandmother, my cousins knew her grandmother. They gave me a lot of information, and on here it says Martha, and I was always looking for Patsy, and I was confused, but I found out Patsy was a nickname.
Okay.
And this is my mother's grandmother. This slide is in a different spot, but this is Ada Haywood. She was married to Prince Haywood. This is on my father's side.
Okay.
Okay, this is a picture of my parents, my mother and father. And this picture was probably taken in maybe the late 60s, Yeah, I think it was taken in the late 60s. It had to be. And then on the other side is a picture of my mother when I lived in Brooklyn, New York. And that picture was taken probably in the late 60s, early 70s. This is a picture of my grandparents. My grandmother is the one on the bottom, you know, the lower one, the smaller picture. My grandmother is the one with the whole full picture. That's my great grandmother. That's my mother's grandmother. And then that's her sister on the other side. Yeah.
Okay.
This is a picture of my mother's family. You know, my mother's sisters and brothers are sitting down. My mother wasn't on there because she was the youngest person. I can kind of tell when that picture was taken because she's not on there and her youngest brother's not on there, but my aunts and uncles are on there and they're sitting down at the bottom. Now, the people on the left of my, I guess on the right of my grandmother are my great aunts and uncles and their wives. On that side where the pointer is next to my grandfather is her her kids from her first marriage. So it's two families together. Is the Woods and the Bondman family that's on there. And my grandfather's name was Madison, and my grandmother's name is Jane Pendleton and Madison Woods.
Okay.
Okay, these are pictures of I have to move this over because I can't see it. This is pictures of my grandfather and my grandmother I'm trying to see how I can move this over. Picture of my grandmother and grandfather. And this is when my grandfather came to visit us. You know, I knew a lot about him. Now, my grandmother, I never knew her because she died when my mother was 6 years old. And on the right-hand side are pictures of some of the pictures of her brothers and sisters. I think it was 7 of them. The last picture, the lady with the gray hair, is not one of the sisters. That's one of the aunts. That's one of my mother's aunts. But the rest are my mother's brothers and sisters. Some of them anyway. All of them are not on there.
Okay.
This is a census for my father. have to move this over so I can see. Mitchell Hardy, his name really was QZ Mitchell Hardy, but he changed it to Mitchell Hardy. So some of the census will be Mitchell Hardy. It shows you that he was Black race, and they usually use the title Negro. He was born in Alabama. He was actually born in Empire, Alabama, and lived in Walker County. His brothers and sisters are listed. Some of them are listed. Bob Hardy was his father. Callie Hardy was his mother. She was 32 at the time. Barb Hardy was 46. And my father was, let's see if I can find his, my father was 8 years old at that time. He was born in 1922. My uncle Johnny B is not on there because he's the baby. My aunt Odessa is not on there because she was the next. And I think my aunt Gertha is not on there. So a few people missing on there because they came after my father.
They weren't born yet.
They weren't born yet.
Okay.
And this is part of that census. So Pete Hardy, the P was for Pete Bob Hardy, no, Prince Bob Hardy. That's my cousin Pat's father. Pat, you heard me talk about a lot, some of you. And you see how it has the name Peanut? And I said, who's Peanut? And then I had to go back and think about who was in the family. And so Peanut was Pete. And Gertha is on there. I thought she wasn't on there. But my Uncle Johnny B is not on there. My Aunt Dassa is not on there. So it was like 9 or 10 of them, family members.
Okay.
That's a picture of my grandfather, my father's father. You can see the resemblance, and my father. And a lot of the brothers kind of look alike. Some of them are light skinned, some of them are dark skinned. This is the picture of my grandmother, my father's mother, and my grandfather, Bob Hardy, and my grandmother, Callie Hardy. This is my father's parents. This is a document, is a census that I found, Robert Hardy, and this was taken in the 1900s. And, you know, this, if you look down and you see Robert Hardy and it says 9 years old, that's my grandfather. And I've just found this really interesting because my grandmother was married again, and she was living with her husband's, no, she was living with, I guess her husband's father, which is Robert Hardy. And I just thought this document was interesting. It says the relationship to the head of the household, the grandson. So they're talking about Robert Hardy, my grandfather, and his father, I guess the grandfather was Edmund Hardy, and his grandmother was Alice Hardy, but his mother was Florence Hardy. So I thought that was interesting. And so that's a way to continue to connect the dots. And that's a way to continue to find out more information. I didn't go any further than that, but because I was just trying to do one side. This is going back to my great grandfather. His name actually was Caffrey Garrett, and I didn't know that until I followed the census, because I always heard Cat Garrett, and you can see in the parentheses under Caffrey Garrett is Cat Garrett, and that's what I was doing the research. And I know that this is him because I'm looking at where he was at that time, Talladega, Alabama, and there was so many of them. And I have a document where it's just so many Garretts that they called it Garrett Street. This is one of his marriages. He was married like 3 times. And he was married to Alice Garrett for like 25 years before, and his daughter was Ada Garrett. That was my grandmother. And I think it's the second document. I don't know if I sent you that. It'll show you Ada Garrett on there. Okay, I guess I didn't. Okay, this is a picture of my great grandmother. This is Ada Garrett. And my grandmother is a tall one, Callie Hardy. Prince Hardy, Callie Hardy is a tall one. The person sitting in the chair is my Uncle BB. And the little lady, the shortest one, is my Aunt Ada, the one that would live to 105, and she was doing the all of the writing. And the other one is one of the sisters. My grandfather is the one on the right side. No, the other side. I guess his left. I don't, it's okay. Yeah, that's my grandfather, Prince Hardy. And I'm not sure who the other man is. My father could never tell me. I think is one of her brothers or something that's in the picture. But the interesting thing about this picture, I don't know when it was taken, but obviously my grandmother, I think, was probably 11 at the time. So I just have to go back and subtract from her date of birth. But the interesting thing about this picture, or any of the pictures, the old pictures, is a photographer, I was told, used to come like maybe twice a year, and they used to dress up and get their picture taken. So that's, and my family is really big on taking pictures. And my father was a photographer as well as a baker. So he has a lot of pictures from, back then.
Okay.
Okay, this is to continue the family legacy. This is just one of the collages I put together. My brothers and sisters are on here. My kids are on here. My grandkids are on here. My parents are on here. And so this is just the immediate family. So this is a picture of my immediate family that I wanted to put together for my kids to continue the legacy as we go on.
Okay.
The youngest one is not on there because she wasn't born when I did this, but I will continue. So I think I'll just say regarding this picture, I think it's important to continue your legacy, to find out where you came from and why you do the things you do, and who inherits. And one other thing I wanted to say, or a couple other things, is that we have a lot of Bobs in our family, named Bobs. We have a lot of Aders, and we have a lot of twins in our family. And then I was always wondering, I found out, this probably came from the white side, but my grandmother was born with gray eyes, and a lot of my cousins have gray eyes. My first cousins and some of their children. So, we're just going to continue the legacy.
Okay, our time's winding down, so I want to be mindful, give people a chance to step away and join the morning service via Zoom. Things to keep in mind, it's not a linear process. So as you find information, you sort of put a leaf or a branch on the family tree. So you don't have to start at the your parents and you can go backwards. As you find information, you just put it in there. It's best to have more than one piece of evidence for any conclusion. So if you have two pieces of evidence, like a birth record and a census record, that say pretty much the same thing, that gives you some confidence. Geometric progression, 2 parents, everybody has 2 parents, everybody has 4 grandparents, everybody has 8 great-grandparents. This project can quickly grow gigantic. And a lot of my family have large families. So, I have 8 siblings. My father had like 9 siblings. So it can get really, really big. Mm-hmm. Imprecise or incomplete records, we've alluded to that multiple times, where a record may not be accurate, but you just want to allow for that. And it's complicated. You've heard that term. For instance, somebody's been married more than once, children born out of wedlock. Some people are like excised from the family history because they were sort of black sheep and you don't know anything about them. So there's a lot of complicated stories. Some of those stories may be troubling. You just have to have an open mind. And finally, what are the rewards? Of course, the aha moment of discovery. Just when you solve a problem and find a piece of information, I think that's just a rewarding moment as you research your family tree. We've been preaching, pastors have been preaching about the idea of a cloud of witnesses. And of course, in the Bible, it refers to people, the prophets of old. But I also like to think of my ancestors as part of that cloud of witnesses. And sometimes I wonder, is my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother, can they look back on me at what I've done, how I live my life, and can they say, I am proud of you. So I think that's just a nice thought to have. You're bequeathing something valuable to your children, as Debbie mentioned. Just knowledge of their heritage. That might be the most important thing you can give to them. Just placing themselves in the history of the family and history of the country. And I also like to think of it as a measure of immortality. There's a saying that when a person dies, every memory, every record of them goes away after a certain number of years. We know about Lincoln, certainly, because, he was a president and so forth. But, there are some people that, there's nobody today knows that they ever existed. But if you bequeath this legacy to your children or those who follow you, in a sense, is a kind of immortality that you're conveying upon yourself. So I think it's a wonderful thing to pursue digging your roots. And I hope this was a useful presentation to you. Our time has come to an end. Thank you for attending. I want to let you know that the morning service will begin in about 15 minutes. It's a separate Zoom, so I'm going to close this Zoom. I've recorded this Zoom, so it will be available when I'm able to post it. I'll post it on YouTube. And we'll close it with a word of prayer. Any final remarks, Debbie? Although we're right at the end.
I just want to say one thing. Just don't give up. It's really important to do that. If you think about doing it and you don't know where to start, you can always Google how to start. So it's just a wonderful thing to do. Even if you come to roadblocks, just start.
Okay, thank you. Keisha, could you give me back control? We're going to close with prayer. Thank you, Lord, for allowing us to come together this morning through the Zoom. I pray that everybody was inspired and enlightened with the presentation about digging our family roots. We ask your blessing upon the morning service that we're about to convey to commence in a short time. From now, we ask your blessing upon all those who participate in the service and all those who will be attending the service. Or we ask for powerful connectivity so that the services will be seamless to everybody participate. We ask that you join us and let your will be done in everything that we do. We praise you for the blessings we receive. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.